I don't know why I'm looking at the notes. One of Santa Fe's best writers and a marvelous human being, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Trent Selazny. If I remember correctly, you need a microphone.
Give me one of those, yeah, one of the wireless ones.
1, 2.
Nice. Where's the mustache?
Oh, what if you did that? You guys get a show. All I get is mustache.
I don't know what you're reading from today. Please tell us.
I will.
Very nice.
I actually read from this 6 months ago or something like that.
This is the first chapter from our novelette I wrote called People Person, and I'm reading it this time because it got shortlisted, but wound up not getting an official nomination for the Brand Stoker Award.
Hang on, I heard louder in the back.
Is this one louder?
Is it? This one's, that's okay?
No, use this.
Oh my God.
Goal! Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, so it was shortlisted, didn't get an official nomination for the Brand Stoker Award, and I'm not bitter about that anymore. Okay, people person. Jeffrey Carlisle was 33 years old, stood 5'8", weighed around 160, and kept his light brown hair in a short buzz cut, over which he typically wore a baseball cap. His clothes generally consisted of sneakers, jeans, and a t-shirt, which he wore now as he climbed out of his RAV4 and walked around it to the shoulder of West Frontage Road. Juniper trees stretched up like fungal fingers. Between Jeff and the trees was the drainage ditch. It was right here where the car had been. Police dispatch had received a call reporting an accident. The caller said they had spoken to the driver of the crashed vehicle. A girl, 26 or 7 years old, said her name was Jessica. There had been no cell phone signal at the time, and the caller had offered to drive her into town, but the girl had said no, thank you, and that someone was on their way. After making sure the girl was okay, the caller drove home and called the police, putting 2 and 2 together, knowing there was no cell phone service. The caller wondered how on earth the girl could have possibly contacted anyone. An officer arrived at the scene and the girl was not present. The car was locked and had a cracked windshield and a dented fender and a deployed airbag. EMS and fire trucks had arrived and cleared the scene. The car was towed to an auto repair shop. There was no immediate search for the girl, as it seemed she had left the scene by herself. That was 3 years ago, and the girl had never been seen or heard from again. Jeff stood there, looking down at the ditch. He was the older brother of the girl who had disappeared, Jessica Carlisle, his baby sister, his only living relative, and for the last 3 years it had become a game of emotionally discombobulated chess. He had no idea if his only living relative was actually living or not. It was mid-afternoon, late summer. The sky above was a clear, dry blue that boasted no clouds, no birds, only the golden stare of the sun, which brooded with a solitary solidarity. He shook his head. He wanted to close his eyes, but they remained open, and he stared into the ditch, pressed his fingers to his temples. It was a remote stretch of road. There were no other people around. No cars drove by. He stood far away from the world, or maybe completely alone in it. He dropped his hands and took a deep breath. Once a week, sometimes more, Jeff usually drove out here. He wasn't sure why. The entire area had been combed at least 100 times, and every visit he made to this spot gave him the same result of forlorn unknowing. The FBI had joined the investigation 10 days after Jessica had disappeared. They had interviewed some of Jessica's friends, as well as Jeff, who had been in Tucson at the time, but came back when he received the news. Eventually, the search had become nationwide. There had been a few ground and air searches, with helicopters, sniffer dogs, and cadaver dogs, and so forth. On one of these searches, somebody found a ripped pair of panties embedded in some dirt, but DNA tests showed that they did not belong to Jessica Carlisle. If she had been harmed, there were no clues to indicate who had assaulted her. Whatever answers there might be, Jeff knew they were not in or around this he came out here anyway, always wondering, always filled with a pathetic and useless modicum of hope, a tiny flicker that was always snuffed out before he even stopped the car. Despair. The word clamped onto him like a bear trap. It was the perfect word, really, and yet it didn't matter. Living in despair or using despair as a distraction were similar, but they weren't to the same point. One still had spirit, while the other was a delusion. Jeff knew his despair intimately. He quaked at the knowledge of what was inside him. And yet if genuine despair still had any sort of spirit, then there was the question of why he felt so spiritless. He looked at the trees and wondered what they'd seen. Then he hacked and spit into the ditch, climbed back into his car, and returned to town. He drove past motels and fast food joints. While he waited at a stoplight, he watched a homeless man push a battered shopping cart. He drove a few more blocks and pulled off into the parking lot of a strip mall. For a long time he sat there, indecision bouncing around inside him. He didn't want to be out, but he didn't want to be home. He didn't want to be anywhere, but unless he wanted to cash in his chips, not being anywhere wasn't a viable option. As indecision bounced around, loneliness settled upon him. The situation comprised much of his life these days. He no longer had many friends in town, hardly any friends left to know. Most of them had either moved away or simply drifted away through the effects of time, and so he sat in the strip mall's parking lot, engine running, AC on, and he watched the people here and there, walking hither and thither. After a small eternity, he sighed and shook his head, and put the car in gear and drove away. That's June.
Thank you, Trent Selazny.